Hello watch lovers, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have two Moonwatches on the bench. Well, in reality the left one is what we call a Moonwatch. The second one is actually a little bit of a hybrid. We'll get back to that. You see the Moonwatch is in a very nice condition. The case actually seems to be unpolished. And these cases are very difficult to polish, so that's a good thing. See, there's a standard layout, black dial, white hands, loom, and then the case back with the Moonwatch engravings. We'll see inside the watch, we have the Omega 861. This watch, we see the gray dial and it does not say Speedmaster Professional. It does, however, also have the exact same movement, the 861. The owner of these two watches, Tom, he actually bought this grey one as a so-called Speedmaster Teutonic. The Teutonic was sold in Germany only, apparently, hence the name, sometimes also referred to as a Mark V. So Tom got this replacement case with a display case back mod. We see that case is pretty over-polished. But yeah, both watches are running, not great, but we'll see what we can do about that. First we're going to take the case backs off, and to do that we have a tool. We want to make sure we do not slip when we use tools like this. That's a very common case of really ugly scratches on the case back. You get these handheld tools, which are basically just scratch makers, so I would never recommend those. For the black watch, we can use our trusted sticky ball, and that one also has a dust cover inside it. Not the sticky ball, the watch. There are no servicing marks, which is a bit strange, because the watch certainly has been opened. We'll see that in a little while. So I'm servicing both watches in this video. So this is the grey watch. The watches are of course very similar, but I'll point out some of the issues with each of them. For the grey watch, we can see that one of the screws is incorrect. And given that this watch has a display case back, we want to fix that. The black watch, meanwhile, has this black smudges, and those are actually from the gasket, or what was once a gasket. So we're going to clean that up as well. I'm going to first unscrew the case screws and take out the crown, and then we can take the movement out of the case. The chronograph seconds hands on these watches can be very tight, so I'm using this cutting tweezer to pull it off. And then I'm using normal hand levers to take off the other hands. See, both dials are in a really nice condition. The Teutonic dials were actually known for being a bit mushy. So quite a few of those don't look very good, but this one is very nice. Here we see another little snag with the grey one. One of the screws in that dial support bridge has disappeared. That one is not visible, however, so it's not as dramatic. And that bridge is only for dial support, so it's not a huge thing. Did I, by the way, say not as dramatic? Well, I suppose that tells you what kind of drama watchmakers have in their lives. When a missing screw is dramatic. So what I'm doing here is just testing the function of the chronograph hour counting mechanism, which is on the dial side. It's a really nice design, to be honest. Relatively simple. Not the kind of crazy you find in the 1340 family, for instance. What I will do, what you don't see, but what I do for pretty much all these parts is I put the screw back in the screw hole. That way we're going to be less confused when we're going to put things back together. As is common with chronographs with an hour counter, the hour counter is driven directly by the barrel. So it's also not flipping over at each hour, but just creeping quietly. The last part we need to take off on the dial side is the cannon pinion. Well, I said last, but we're also going to take off this dial support bridge. And then we can turn the movement over onto the train side. The train side is where most of the magic happens. One thing to note with this movement is that the reset pusher, the spring, is actually driven from the dial side. So now that I've disassembled that, this pusher here, the reset, will not pop out by itself. So let's have a little bit closer look at the black watch with its really heavy smudges here and there. So these are actually from the gasket. So the gasket has disintegrated and become this gooey black smudge. So someone has opened the watch and sort of moved things around a little bit, touched things here and there. But we'll clean that up. I do have quite a few chronograph videos on the channel. So the disassembly part of this video will be relatively quick and straightforward, and then we'll take a little bit more time for the assembly. So I'm going to let down the power on the mainspring, and then we're going to take out the balance. There will be a little bit power left in the train, but shouldn't be a lot. It's also not strictly necessary to let down the power to take off the chronograph parts because they are engaged and disengaged with the pushers, but it's still a good habit. Another good habit when working on chronographs is to always take off the springs holding parts in place first. That way you have fewer pings. So pretty much all these different levers have a spring attached to them that presses them into one position. So we take those off first, and then we can take off the levers. So while disassembling the movement, we can take a little time to talk about the Moonwatch. So there is a saying that necessity is the mother of invention. In my opinion, it's absolutely not. It's two main things that are the drivers on innovation and inventions, and those are laziness and war, unfortunately. So the Second World War was followed by what we call the Cold War, in which the West, mainly US and Western Europe, were in a kind of warlike competition and struggle against the Soviet Union and its allied states. It was a Cold War in the sense that there wasn't actual fighting on any battleground. It was mainly, let's say, the two ideological systems trying to prove which one was better. So the West with market economies and capitalism, and then the Soviets with communism and planned economies. Let's, by the way, just take a second to look at something that used to be a lubricant. This rubber-like green substance. If anyone wants to venture a guess as to what this once was, then go ahead in the comment section. So the Cold War was fought in all kinds of areas and arenas, chief among them sports and science. One fun anecdote from the sports side. So in the 1970s, there was a friendly athletics competition between the US and the Soviet Union. And the US won, but the reporting in the Soviet press was that there had been a competition in which the Soviet Union came into a glorious second place, while the Americans were second to last. Which isn't technically untrue, but anyway, the other major arena for the Cold War competition was science. And the Soviet Union actually were the first to send both something into space and people into space. So to one-up the Soviets, Kennedy made a vow in 1961 that the Americans would go to the moon in that century, so in the 1960s. As you might imagine, a relatively big project. So one small piece of that was to choose a watch that could be worn in space and on the moon. So there were a few competitors. Rolex, Longines and Omega were the ones going to the final round, the final selection. And ultimately Omega were the ones chosen. And that selection actually took place in 1965, so 4 full years before the actual moon landing. But that's how we got the Moonwatch. So with all the parts laid out, we're ready for the cleaning machine. And let me also take this opportunity to thank all my YouTube and Patreon members. Getting quite a collection of enthusiasts there now. If you're curious about what members actually get, then you can click on the join button below to see the different tiers and what they offer. Or you can go to this URL on patreon.com. Let's then turn our attention to the cases. So the black watch, that old gasket is completely degraded. So in order to not get a lot of that black stuff everywhere, I first want to take off the pushers. Most high quality chronographs have these screw-in pushers and also those screw-in tubes actually. We'll first take out the gaskets inside the tubes. And it's quite incredible that what was once rubber now is sort of like tar. Just a really thick, gooey, black something. So the reason I'm doing it like this and not just putting it into an ultrasonic is that I do not want to put the bezel into the ultrasonic. The bezel probably would be just fine because it's made of metal, but still, better safe than sorry. So use this little device to take off the bezel. You can get it off with just a normal case knife as well. This is a little bit safer. And then for the grey watch, I take the bezel off first. There's no goo in that one. The gasket in that one is still intact. The crystals are the original crystals, so I'm going to reuse them. Just take out the west scratches. You can see the Omega logo in the center there. And with the last gasket out, we can then put the metallic parts into the ultrasonic. Now, if you don't know what the ultrasonic sounds like, then brace yourselves. It is not a pleasant sound. Alright, so we got the movement back from the cleaning machine. We're going to put the escapement parts into this little basket for immersing in a liquid called Fixodrop. Fixodrop is a kind of epilam. And what the epilam does, it leaves a very thin film on the surface of the stuff you put into the liquid. And that film then keeps the lubrication in place better. So after immersing the parts in the fixer drop, the pallet fork, we're just going to dip the pallet jewels into the liquid, and that will be enough for the pallet fork. Then we put a couple of tiny little drops of oil in the center of the capstones. That will make sure there's very, very little friction when the balance staff rotates. And that is key to good timekeeping. The balance is really kind of the beating heart of a mechanical watch. So we want to make sure the balance oscillates nicely and freely. So to do that, we reassemble the shock setting with the jewels under these little springs. And then we can puff the balance and see if it oscillates. And that looks just fine. All right. We can then start reassembling the rest of the train, starting with the first wheel in the train, which is also the barrel. Gonna put in a new mainspring. What I do is I press it down a little bit with the back of the tweezers. And then I use the tips of the tweezer to press the bridle part down into the drum first. That's, in my experience at least, the best way to get the mainspring properly into the barrel. And then we can put the barrel arbor in, give a little bit of oil on the rotation points. And there we have the barrel. But this is a chronograph with an hour counter, so we also need to put the hour counting parts onto the barrel. So these parts need to be a friction fit. What that means is that that little pinion we put onto the barrel arbor there, it needs to have enough friction to follow the barrel when the chronograph is in action, and not so much friction that it stops the barrel when the watch is running normally. So that would be very difficult to achieve with just that pinion. So the designers of the movement then also put in this little clamp, which has two prongs that add friction. But those two prongs, we're also going to put a tiny little bit of lubrication underneath. And lastly, we want to test that this pinion rotates with a little bit of resistance, but not too much, of course. While building the base movement, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the movements used in the Moonwatch. And let's also clarify one other thing. So the first man who set foot on the moon was famously Neil Armstrong. The second man who set foot on the moon was actually the one wearing the Speedmaster. And that was Buzz Aldrin, seen here wearing the actual Moonwatch. The watch that Buzz Aldrin wore had the caliber 321, which was very similar to this caliber, the 861. The main difference being, of course, that the 861 has a cam-shifted mechanism instead of a column wheel. Now here is where things get interesting, where they come together in a very cool way. The 321 was basically the Lemania 2310 with an added hour counter. And for those of you who follow the channel or have seen a few other videos, I've done videos on the three contenders for the first automatic chronograph. And funnily enough, the 2310 was actually modded into an automatic chronograph back in 1947. So Lemania and Omega actually built the first automatic chronograph, a full 22 years before Psycho, Zenith or Project 99 came with their automatic chronographs. In 1969, the very year that Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the moon with his Moonwatch. And granted, the 2310 automatic chronograph was just a concept, it was never put into production. And the concept was rejected for business reasons. They didn't think anyone would have an interest in an automatic chronograph. Yeah, that's how it goes. Now, before putting in the escape wheel, did anyone notice this when we disassembled the watch? If you did, then kudos, because that is not how the escape wheel should look when it rotates. So if we look at it in a little bit more detail, we will actually find that it's bent. It's broken. You can clearly see that here. You see the reflection of the escape wheel on the right there. So it's clear that the light is not reflected uniformly. And under the microscope we can see that the wheel is actually broken there. So yeah, we're gonna put in a new escape wheel. Gonna clean it first after taking it out of the pack. Probably been sitting there for 50 years. Not so easy to see on the wheel itself, but it was also a bit out of true, as you could probably see when it was spinning during disassembly. So it must have gotten some pretty rough treatment at some point. And for those keeping count, that escape wheel was in the grey watch. Alright, we turned the movement over so we can put in the keyless works. The keyless works on this watch are very standard. So why not tell an idiot story while we do the keyless works? So I lived in Switzerland now for a bit more than 3 years, and one of the things that surprised me when I moved here is that it's still common to use kind of a diesel to heat your houses. So it's a diesel called mazout. It's just a kind of a gas oil or diesel. And you burn it. You have a big tank in your house. We have a 7,000 liter tank. And it's burnt. And while it burns, of course, you produce heat that then heats the water. So there's a big water tank that's being heated. Not super efficient, not very economical, and certainly not very environmentally friendly either. So we decided to change it for a heat pump. So today the heat pump company came and they brought with them 2 big tanks where the heated water would be stored in. And they asked where they should put the tanks, and of course the tanks would go in the basement together with the boiler from the heat pump. But being the idiot I am, when they asked me where they should put the tanks, I pointed to the far end of the garden and said, yeah, maybe one there and one at the other end of the garden. Of course, I was making a joke that I kind of thought was funny. But I really discovered that there are very clear limits to my French. So these guys, they took me seriously and they started like looking back and forth and started calling other people, trying to figure out how they could place the tanks down in the soil in my garden. And I was like, no, guys, I'm just joking, just trying to make a joke. And ultimately I had to look up the word for joke and tell them. So yeah, I'm not sure I got any street cred on that one, but that's how idiots roll. Anyway, we put the keyless works back together. We've lubricated almost all of it, and there's some excess lubrication that we're going to remove with some Rodico. And then we are good to go. With a new escape wheel in place, we can then place the pallet fork. Now you might remember that we immersed the pallet jewels in Fix-A-Drop. So I'm not showing that on the camera, but I put in the balance and I let it run for a couple of minutes, so it will scrape path at the middle of the impulse faces of the jewels. And then we put a tiny little drop of oil there and let that distribute over the escape wheel teeth. Alright, let's put some more power on the watch, and then we're gonna put in the balance. You can see I put the pallet fork to one side and then I put the balance in accordingly so that the impulse jewel on the balance will go into the notch of the pallet fork. And then we can lubricate the remaining jewels. And then we're going to demagnetize the movement and put it on the time grapher. I'm going to show the adjustments for one of the movements. You see this one is a bit off, nice straight lines. So we take out the beat error by moving this mobile stud carrier, and then we adjust the index to get a decent rate. And then we see for both watches that looks alright. Alright, then we can start building the chronograph. First thing I like to do is putting on this driving wheel. It has to mesh very well with the clutch. So before screwing anything down, I check that mesh. So here we see the driving wheel is a bit too high. That's what we have to do, is press it down a little bit more. And that looks better. When building a chronograph, what we want to make sure is that we have a good grasp of which parts go under other parts. Otherwise we might very easily find ourselves having to take off a lot of parts just to put in the one we kind of forgot. And no, I'm not talking from experience, no. So one good kind of tell in terms of which parts go under other parts is of course that when there are recesses in the plate, then there's a good chance something has to go in that recess, and that will of course be under all the other parts. Here's the intermediate minute counter wheel, and we can see it's actually just sitting in a pivot, which is kind of unusual, as is the jumper for the minute counter wheel. No, it's my...
I'm not wet.
What?
I'm not wet.
You're wet? It's
the rain. Didn't you see outside? It's raining.
Oh, I didn't see it. Been working inside.
My hands are wet.
There's a towel. Oh, you're cold also. There's a towel out there if you want to dry your hands.
I want to see the watch. It's working.
Yeah.
See? There. It's working there.
Yeah, I see it. I'm happy it's working.
Here.
Yeah, it's working so far at least. Still quite a few chronograph parts to put on before the chronograph also works, but a good start. So going a little bit back to our discussion on the movements. So the 861 is basically the 321 with cam shift instead of column wheel. And this way of doing it with a cam was a bit cheaper to manufacture. That's also why you see the cam prevalent in Le Mans movements after this time. But Omega famously also reintroduced the 321 just a few years back. Admittedly in some limited quantities, but the 321 was of course the movement that was the first on the moon. And yes, column wheel chronographs are a bit smoother to operate than cam shifted ones. So we see that even in this expensive high-grade movement, there are some plastic parts. So plastic is actually a pretty good material in a lot of ways. It is actually self-lubricating. And the plastic type used here is called Delrin. But still, we don't really like seeing it. Just doesn't feel right to see plastic in a very expensive watch. In essence, this movement is a traditional horizontal clutch chronograph. So it has the same typical layout as we're kind of used to in horizontal clutch chronographs. And those are the traditional chronographs, if you will. So you'll be seeing this kind of layout a lot if you work on chronographs, which makes it easier to work on them, of course. Here we're putting in the hammer. The hammer is the piece that flips onto the heart-shaped cams on top of the chronograph counting wheels, and thus forces them to reset. And of course, in the reset position, that's where we put the hands on at 0. The reset button is a little bit strange construct, so we have to release this screw here, and then we can put the lever in itself. But the spring is actually on the dial side. So for now, we'll just have to pull it out. This is the hour counting lever that transfers the power to the other side, and we remember that the screw was not original. So I found a screw that has the correct thread, but the screw is a little bit too wide, so it doesn't fit in the cutout, and also it's flat instead of rounded. So I'm first going to take off a little bit of the diameter on the watchmaker's lathe, and then I'm going to take off the edge to round it. And lastly, I'm going to use a set of fine abrasives to make it nice and round and smooth, and also quite polished. And then the end result should look quite a lot like the original screw. So this is a bit more length than we'd normally go to, but given that this grey watch has a display case back, we want to make sure it looks good. This is the black watch, and here we actually do have the original screw. Of course, we could have switched the 2 screws. Maybe that would have simplified things, but hindsight is 2020. Let's start the chronograph and see how the minute wheel flips over. We'll speed it up a little bit and then zoom in, and here we see that little spring on the chronograph wheel pushing the teeth on the intermediate counter wheel. On the intermediate counting wheel. Let's also then test the stop and the reset, and then we can go over to the dial side again. This bridge here doesn't have any real function apart from just supporting the dial. So in this hole here is that lever on the other side, the hour counter lever. So whenever that lever is moved to the side, then the lever we just put in now will then set the hour counting in motion. This is the hour counting wheel. We can see it meshes directly with the barrel and the pinion on top of the barrel. And this part here is then the hour counter hammer. So when the chronograph mechanism is not in use, the hour counter stop lever will hold that hour wheel in place. And then when we press the start button, that same lever will then take the hammer away from the hour wheel. This here is that hour counter stop lever. And as we will soon see, the tip of the hour counter stop lever goes into that prong on the hammer and then lifts the hammer away from the hour wheel. Gonna try that in a little while. First we have to put on the various springs. Some of the springs are pretty strong, and we don't want to scratch the movements, so we'll use something that doesn't scratch. And then here finally we have the reset spring, which makes sure that the reset button pops out again after we press it. With all that in place, let's have a look at the hour wheel moving. Now the hour wheel makes 1 revolution in 12 hours. So this stripe here, we're going to see it move. And that small movement we see here is about 15 minutes of footage. So yeah, it doesn't move very fast. So not that many people use the chronograph or anything but showing off to their friends anyway. I must admit though, one notable exception to that was actually on the Apollo missions. You might have seen a movie or heard about Apollo 13 when everything went haywire. So the crew had to manually adjust the trajectory of the landing module. so they didn't bounce off the Earth. So in order to do that, Jack Swigert, one of the astronauts, had to manually fire booster rockets for 14 seconds. And of course he used his Moonwatch to time that. So that is a pretty notable exception to just showing off. Of course you can use that to show off your Moonwatch and say, hey look, I'm going to show you how Jack Swigert did it in Apollo 13. Look, 14 seconds. Anyway, we are busy putting on the hands. Going a little bit back and forth between the black and the grey watch. One thing when placing the hands on this kind of watch where you have a spring-loaded reset, there's thus no benefit to keep pressing the reset pusher. It will not keep the hammer onto the hard-shaped cams. So that makes it a little bit more finicky sometimes. Now Tom, he wanted to do something different for the chronograph hand, so the seconds hand on the grey watch. So I got a new hand. The hands are painted with oil paint. So we're first going to strip off that oil paint and then we're going to paint it with a red paint instead. So this is an industry strength paint remover. Pretty toxic stuff, you don't want to get that on your hands. So I'm just putting some in a glass jar. And then I'm going to put the hand inside it and let it stay for a while. And then we should be able to easily strip off the paint. You can, of course, also just paint over the oil paint, but the result might be a little bit, how should I say it, more uneven than if you paint directly onto the metal. So you see the oil paint comes off pretty easily. And of course, after removing the oil paint, we have to clean the hand thoroughly before starting applying the new paint. So here's the new paint. Initially I painted the entire hand, and of course I had to relume it as well. And then it struck me that the base of the hour minute hands are actually polished. So I removed some of the red paint to mimic that. Let's check the reset. And yeah, don't let the reset hit your finger. We're going to take out the scratches on the crystals. Do that by using a few different grits of sandpaper, wet and dry, before then finally using Polywatch. A little bit laborious, but it does produce pretty good results. And when you have original crystals, you basically want to keep them. Before recasing the movements, we then want to put the chronograph pushers back in. So we first put in new gaskets, used silicone on them, and then we put the springs into the pusher tubes. And then we put the pushers on the outside of the tubes, and then we screw down the pusher screw inside the case. Using a little bit of silicone on those ridges as well in the tube. These old watches will not be very water resistant, but can try to help a little bit. And there the black watch is more or less ready. Just need to put in the stem and the crown. And then of course we also have to put on the bezel again. We clean the bezel a little bit, just with some pegwood and some Rodico, just to make sure there's not a lot of gunk blocking the bezel to be pressed on. Because you need quite a lot of force to press this on, and if there is some dirt or gunk, then that just makes it a little bit more difficult. So for the black watch, you might remember that the gasket was in a less than ideal condition. So Tom actually got a new gasket for it. We're gonna treat that with silicone first, and then we can put it in place. And then ditto with the grey watch. So I mentioned that the grey watch has this display caseback mod. And it's a question I get pretty frequently. How come vintage watches do not have display casebacks? And the answer is very simple. It was just not an option. To have a display caseback, you need a very strong glass. And up till the 1970s, you basically only had Hesselite or plexiglass crystals, and that would not be strong enough. Of course, when you started getting watches with the mineral crystals in the late 70s, 80s, and then eventually with sapphire, that's when you started having display casebacks. So the mod for the grey watch is that someone simply cut out part of the caseback and put in a sapphire crystal. Alright, there we have the watches. Before seeing them on the wrist, I just want to remind you that at vintagewatchservices.eu you will always find more than 100 beautiful vintage watches. And as a YouTube subscriber, you can use this coupon code for 10% off. I don't have an original bracelet for these watches, but still think they look mighty nice on just a leather strap. Two quite different watches, but both of them look very cool, I think. I hope you liked this video. If you did, then please click like and subscribe. I'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.